Greetings to you all, wherever this may find you. My name is Stephen Renderos, and I'm the Executive Director of Media Justice. We're a national movement building hub fighting for racial, economic, and gender justice in a digital age. I'm grateful to the United Church of Christ Media Justice Ministry for inviting me to introduce your keynote speaker for this year's Everett C. Parker Lecture, Eric K. Ward. Eric is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He is the recipient of the 2021 Civil Courage Prize, the first time in the award's history that an American has won the prize, revealing the dangerous proliferation of hate crimes and political violence by authoritarian and extremist movements in the United States. Eric brings over 3 decades of leadership in community organizing and philanthropy to his role as Western States Network's Executive Director and Senior Fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. Since Eric took the helm in 2017, Western States Center has become a national hub for innovative responses to white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and structural inequality towards a world where everyone can live, love, work, and worship free from bigotry and fear. One of the aspects of Eric's work that I'm a particular fan of is Western States Network's Inclusive Democracy Cultural Lab, where Eric engages artists and musicians as critical change makers. Eric is originally from my hometown, Los Angeles, and began his civil rights work when the white nationalist movement was engaged in violent paramilitary activity that sought to undermine democratic governance in the Pacific Northwest. I can go on and on about all the things this brilliant person has accomplished, and I still wouldn't do justice to his importance as a critical leader in building the inclusive democracy all of us deserve. Over the past year, as our world descended into a dark period defined by a pandemic of COVID and white nationalism that both were killing our people first, it was Eric's words that I turned to the most. Recently, he wrote, "It's too easy, intense moments like these, moments of fighting monsters, to become monsters ourselves." Eric is a leader who reminds us that the best antidote to hate is love. He has an ability to see humanity in all of us. It inspires me, and I'm so grateful you get to hear from him. Now, the best thing I can do is get out of the way and let you hear from him first. Please welcome Eric K. Ward.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, everyone, for being with us today. It has been a long 4 years, but as my father reminds me, who turned 96 last week, it has been a long 96 years in America. The arc of justice is often slow-moving, and the urgency to come and ally, to lift up the opportunities and the future, right, of those who are most impacted by inequality weighs heavy on our shoulders in this moment. The Reverend Everett Parker understood this, and so too do our honorees today, Francella and Angela. I congratulate you, but I also thank you for your work and the sacrifices that you have made to do that work, the sacrifices that aren't part of the stories that are told each and every day. I also thank you for each and every day lifting up those who you represent and who are reflections of your work each and every day. But I embrace you for your courage to dream of a future world where everyone can live, love, worship, and work free from fear. That is really the essence of Reverend Parker. He understood some fundamental pieces, which I will get to soon. My name is Eric Ward, as Stephen said, Executive Director of Western States Center. Western States Center, based out of Portland, Oregon, works to advance a mission that expands inclusive democracy. By inclusive democracy, we simply mean a system of government that centers people, that is transparent and accountable. That we understand that democracy is the most radical of experiments. The idea that we, the people, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, religion, can come together without dictators, without royalty, without corporate bosses, to decide our destinies, to figure out our challenges, and to move a society forward together, grounded in opportunity and equity. That work has been struggled over for decades in this country, and we still have far to go. But it's important that we don't become the Eeyores of social movements, meaning it is always important to take a moment to recognize the things that have been done and to dream of the things that will be done. It's hard to do so in this moment. I often find myself taking deep breaths over these last 4 years as we have watched violence, the intimidation, the exploitation, and the othering of ourselves and our neighbors. As those have manipulated and utilized social media platforms to drive division and to organize bigotry. And for those large businesses to put their profits over the cohesion and peacefulness of a society. Indeed, in these moments, it can seem awful dark. We all witnessed the events of January 6th in Washington, D.C., where attempted insurrection injured over 140 law enforcement officers. We watched as elected officials, our highest elected officials, huddled in protection in small rooms as a mob raged seeking to overturn democracy in America. Since 2015, right-wing extremists have been involved in 267 plots or attacks and 91 fatalities between 2015 and the insurrection. What is most concerning is that the number of domestic terror plots and attacks are at the highest they have been in decades. But we need to be clear. The insurrection on January 6th did not end that day in Washington, D.C. That insurrection continues in cities and counties around the country. Health workers, educators, school board members, local elected officials find themselves being threatened, facing physical attacks and disruptions each and every day. It can seem almost insurmountable in this moment. How do we understand what is occurring around us? And how do we begin to move forward? I believe that we first have to understand and address 3 of our own myths around how we understand this social movement. We should be clear first before we get to this myth that we are dealing with 2 phenomena in our society right now that call for our immediate attention. The first is the vestiges and legacy of white supremacy, a system that was created to organize society in North America. It was a system that was built off the exploitation of African people, the stolen resources and thefts of native lands and their lives. And the third, not often discussed or addressed, the exploitation and the social control of women, misogyny. It was slavery, chattel slavery. It was misogyny and the treatment and stolen resources of Native people that allowed this society to construct an ideology called white supremacy. The belief that some people are superior and others are inferior on nothing more than the color of a person's skin. We should understand that this was not a value-neutral summation, that thousands were killed and exploited and injured from this system. White supremacy was successfully confronted in the 1960s by a 1960 civil rights movement. This 1960 civil rights movement challenged white supremacy as the rule of law and overthrew it. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not here today to say that white supremacy no longer exists. It certainly exists in culture. It certainly exists in behavior and economics each and every day. What I'm here to address is that 1960 civil rights movement successfully challenged white supremacy as the only lens upon which we could understand our society. But look, no good deed goes unpunished. And at the peak of the civil rights movement, a backlash began to form. January in Washington, D.C. in 2021 actually begins as a backlash against the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. Imagine for a second, you are someone who believes in white superiority, in Jim Crow. You haven't been convinced of it. You've simply been socialized to see the world that way. Each and every day, it is the air you breathe. And all of a sudden, you wake up one morning to realize you suffered the biggest political defeat of white supremacy. How do you explain it? Do you all of a sudden just say, well, I guess Black people weren't as inferior as we thought? No, people don't change their minds so quickly. So they constructed an answer similar to how I did when I would do poorly on tests in schools. I always had a reason, never involved, not studying hard enough or not checking in with an instructor. Instead, I began to construct myths around why I failed. So too did those committed to separate but equal. They were never going to admit that they lost to Black growing political and moral power in this country. To do so would be to admit, right, the fallacies of white supremacy and the false belief of racial superiority. So they constructed a new argument. And this is the first piece that we have to understand in this moment. Whether we are talking about systemic racism or the rise of a white nationalist social movement, both of these moments that we face in our society are grounded upon the lens of race. If white supremacy, the system of exploitation and discrimination, is written upon the paper of racism targeting Black and Indigenous communities, the rise of white nationalism is written upon the paper of anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, the belief that there is a Jewish conspiracy to destroy white America. When we heard Nazis marching on the streets of Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us, they were pulling from this old belief constructed in the 60s. Look, anti-Semitism isn't just at the core of white nationalism. It is the core of white nationalism. It is so central to white nationalism that I believe as a Black person that I, my community, and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. Let me explain. As I said, amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of the modern day movement is an explicit claim that Jews are a separate race. You see, for white nationalists, their anti-Jewish hatred is also a form of racism. They claim that the position of Jews as white in American society is the greatest trick the devil has ever played. They place Jews as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. It is that fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains for white nationalists how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, but also how feminists and the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how immigrant workers can mount successful challenges to economic inequality. Folks often ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the room? It's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide, he was taking on and using language that was ultimately familiar, intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Each and every day, it is not just the Jewish community, but non-Jews who pay the price of this unchallenged anti-Semitism. We remember the white nationalists who targeted Black worshipers in Charlotte, South Carolina, or Latinos who were targeted in a Walmart, or Sikh worshipers in Wisconsin. While we understand the anti-Black racism, the anti-immigrant and anti-Latino racism, and the Islamophobia that respectively drove those murders, we are less aware that in each case, the killer believed that he was targeting those communities of color because they were waging an existential war against the Jewish community. In short, anti-Semitism is as much of a threat to non-Jews as the Jewish community. And it is the primary narrative that drives the white nationalist movement today. We must confront anti-Semitism. The second myth that we often use to disempower ourselves is the belief that the white nationalist movement is made up of individuals who are uneducated or poor or alienated from society. That is simply not true. The truth is that if there are many working poor people, if there are many folks who haven't had the opportunity to go to college, if there are folks who are alienated who are attracted to the white nationalist movement, that is because that is who is largely inside of our society. James Aho, a professor at the University of Idaho, in his seminal study of the white nationalist movement, The Politics of Righteousness, Christian Patriotism in Idaho, did an incredible study that highlighted some things we should all understand. The white nationalist movement in Idaho had a higher level of income than the general population of Idaho as a whole. It had a higher level of education than the general population of Idaho as a whole, and was more politically active. What does this tell us? This tells us simply that we have to understand that we are in a moment when we are dealing with a social movement, a highly evolved social movement that includes working class folks, but also those of different class levels, some who are highly educated. That this white nationalist social movement seeking to overthrow American democracy has its think tanks, its foundations, its organizers, and its new constituencies. In challenging this movement, we cannot assert our own prejudices, our own myths. It is a movement that fundamentally seeks to overthrow the United States of America, not take us back to the myths of Gone with the Wind. It sees white supremacy as a failed program. It no longer seeks to exploit communities of color, but to rid communities of color and Jews through a program of ethnic cleansing. We have to understand that in this moment, the white nationalist movement is building a constituency, and we must address that constituency. We must compete for its base and provide an alternative mission. If the first two myths are around how white nationalism is driven through the racism of anti-Semitism, its configuration much more complex than we give credit. It is this third point that I want to leave you with that is critically important. About 4 years ago, there was a large alt-right demonstration here in Portland. There was an alt-right activist who was trying to catch his breath in the confrontation. And he was being interviewed by a citizen journalist who was screaming at him, demanding that this alt-right white nationalist activist explain why he was here in Portland. Didn't he know the city of Portland didn't want him? Didn't he know the mayor of Portland, Oregon didn't want him? That no one wanted him in this community. Why was he here? What this white nationalist activist said in response should haunt us all. He said simply, I've heard we're not wanted here, but Portland is one of the cities in America with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number. You can say you don't want us here, he went on, But you all are actually doing something we could never get away with. You are literally disappearing the Black population of Portland, Oregon. And here lies my final point. The truth of the matter is, white nationalists and their broader alt-right coalition don't bring racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia to our communities. They simply organize the bigotry that already exists. If we seek to take back this country from the political violence and chaos of white nationalist nihilism, we too have to face a truth. We have to be brave enough to pick up the mirror. This moment is not merely about managing threats, but about doubling down on the vision of what we mean when we say an America for all. We have to practice that vision each and every day. We have to give our communities and societies the opportunity to practice what it means to be an American. This is what Angela and Francella do each and every day. Expanding democracy, centering people each and every day. This is what the Reverend Dr. Everett C. Parker did with his life, committing to opening up space so that all of us can be seen and our stories heard. I want to be clear. What's happening right now is frightening. But we are not immobilized in this moment. Don't believe the hype. Whether it is digital platforms, we should understand that companies can do something if they choose to. It is not out of their control. And at the community level, if we are still facing insurrections in our community, we too can do something. We merely need to follow the example of Angela and Francella, who took the courageous step forward, who dared to dream. When I was a kid, we used to play a game, and it was called If I Were. If I Were merely us sitting out in front of the lawn. And one at a time, we would come up with something. Like, if I found myself in a zoo and a lion got loose, here's what I would do. We'd argue about what we would do and how we would get out of it. Or if I was in a car and the brakes went out, here's what I would do. But each and every summer, one question always came up. If I were in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement, here is what I would do. Whoa, would we argue? We had strong opinions as kids about what we would or wouldn't put up with. We didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents and grandparents who grew up under white supremacy as a solid, unchallenged lens. We had no way of understanding the choices they had to make each and every day. So we were full of bravado. You may have had your own if I were moments, either alone or in conversations. What would we have done in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement? Well, I'm here to tell you today, you no longer have to wonder. Whatever it is you would have done in the 1960s civil rights movement is exactly what you will do at the end of this lecture. You should understand that the choices before you are both moral and historic. You cannot be neutral in this moment. You must either pick the side of inclusion or exclusion. I leave you with this. Understand that you can make a difference. We watch the work of media justice each and every day. Double down in this moment. There is no reason to be hoarding your energy and resources for a longer arc. This is the point in history where we have the privilege to launch a 21st century civil rights movement. one that speaks to the challenges of today, one built through 75 years of sacrifice by those who came before us, one that leads a legacy for the generations that follow. This is our United States, if we choose it to be. One free from fear and bigotry. We merely have to choose it. It's your time to choose. Make it count. History will judge you.